The Choctaw Who Broke the Line. October 8, 1918, 4:27 a.m. Saint-Étienne-à-Agnès, France. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive had already cost 26,000 American lives in 3 weeks. Another 95,000 lay wounded in field hospitals that ran out of morphine days earlier. The German defensive line, a 4-year fortress of reinforced concrete, barbed wire, and interlocking machine gun positions, had not moved, not 1 meter. 47 Allied assaults had failed against this sector alone. Command had stopped counting the dead. They started counting the hours until winter made advance impossible. In a trench that smelled of mud and gangrene, a 24-year-old Choctaw farmer from Oklahoma checked his rifle. He'd been given orders no rational man would accept. He didn't speak. The Meuse-Argonne was not a battle. It was a mathematical equation written in blood. General John Pershing needed to break through German lines before November frost made the ground impassable. Every division had tried. The 1st Division, the big red one, lost 8,000 men in 10 days and gained 900 meters. The 2nd Division, including Marines who'd survived Belleau Wood, was bled down to 40% strength in a single week. The 42nd Rainbow Division, comprised of National Guard units from across America, attacked the same ridge 7 times. 7 times they were thrown back, leaving their dead tangled in wire that stretched unbroken for kilometers. Each assault wave shattered against pillboxes manned by soldiers who'd held this ground since 1914. These weren't conscripts. They were veterans, men who'd survived Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele. They knew how to kill advancing infantry. They'd been doing it for 4 years. German artillery knew every shell crater, every approach route, every fold in the terrain. Forward observers sat in concrete observation posts with direct telephone lines to gun batteries positioned 8 kilometers back. When American troops massed for attack, shells arrived within 90 seconds. High explosive, shrapnel, gas. The barrages were timed to catch men in the open, where they couldn't dig in or retreat. Casualty clearing stations overflowed. Field hospitals ran out of bandages, morphine, surgical thread. Surgeons worked by candlelight when generators failed. They amputated limbs without anesthesia when supplies ran out. Still, the wounded kept coming. Stretcher bearers worked in shifts around the clock, carrying men through mud that was sometimes waist-deep, under fire from machine guns that never seemed to sleep. Many stretcher bearers were killed. No one counted them separately from infantry losses. They were just numbers added to the daily casualty reports that went up to division, then corps, then to Pershing's headquarters, where staff officers plotted them on maps and calculated how long the offensive could continue before the American Expeditionary Force bled itself out completely. Still, the line held. By early October, the offensive had devolved into trench-to-trench attrition, the same nightmare that had consumed France for 4 years and killed a generation of European men. The Americans were learning what the British and French had learned in 1915. Courage doesn't break concrete, and initiative doesn't stop machine gun fire. Doctrine required adaptation. Pershing needed shock troops, men willing to cross open ground under direct fire, men who didn't flinch when orders meant certain death, men who, perhaps most importantly, had nothing to lose and therefore everything to prove. The 142nd Infantry Regiment, Oklahoma National Guard, was deployed to the worst sector on the map, a salient where 3 previous assaults had collapsed in less than an hour. Most of the 142nd were farmers. Some had never left their county before enlistment. They spoke English as a second language, if they spoke it fluently at all. They'd been trained for 8 weeks, issued equipment that didn't fit, and shipped to France with the understanding that their survival wasn't a priority. They were Choctaw. The Army called them Indians. The men called themselves what they'd always been, expendable. Joseph Oklahomby had spent his entire life being told what he couldn't do. Born in 1895 near Wright City, Oklahoma, He grew up on land the federal government had carved from Choctaw territory and sold to white settlers under the Dawes Act. The law had been explicit. Tribal lands would be divided into individual plots, and everything left over would be opened to homesteaders. His family's allotment was rocky soil, poor drainage, far from any town. His father farmed rented earth because the allotment wasn't enough to sustain a family. His mother spoke a language schools had tried to beat out of her. She'd attended the Armstrong Academy, a boarding school where Choctaw children were sent to civilize them. The curriculum was simple. Forget your language, forget your customs, become invisible. She'd returned home at 16, fluent in English and ashamed of Choctaw. She taught Joseph both languages, but only one in public. Joseph learned English in a mission school, where speaking Choctaw earned a whipping. The teachers were well-meaning white women from Pennsylvania who believed they were saving souls. They believed native children were backward, primitive, capable of improvement only through complete cultural erasure. Joseph learned to keep his head down, work the fields, stay invisible. When teachers asked questions, he answered in English. When they praised him, he nodded and said nothing. At home, he spoke Choctaw with his grandparents, who refused to speak anything else. They told him stories about the old days, before removal, when the Choctaw Nation governed itself and owned the land from horizon to horizon. They told him about the Trail of Tears, though the Choctaw walked a different trail than the Cherokee. They told him how a third of their people died on the march from Mississippi to Oklahoma, and how the government had promised them new land in exchange for the old, then broke that promise within a generation. They told him these things quietly, in the language schools had tried to erase, and then they told him to survive. Survival meant invisibility. It meant not asking for what you deserved. It meant working twice as hard for half the recognition, and never complaining when you got nothing. When the draft notices came in 1917, federal law didn't recognize Native Americans as citizens. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own land in many states. They couldn't serve on juries or testify against white defendants in most courts. But they could be conscripted. The Selective Service Act made no exemptions for non-citizens. If you were male, aged 21 to 30, and physically able, you registered. Joseph didn't protest. Protesting meant trouble, and trouble for an Indian in Oklahoma meant jail or worse. He reported to Camp Bowie, Texas, where a recruiting officer spelled his name wrong on the enlistment form and never corrected it. Joseph didn't correct it either. What did it matter? The name was just another mark in another white man's ledger. They issued him a Springfield M1903 rifle, serial number worn smooth by previous hands. They issued him a wool uniform that didn't fit, trousers too long, tunic too tight across the shoulders. They issued him boots that gave him blisters within a week, and they issued him orders to sail for France on a transport ship that smelled like vomit and coal smoke, packed with 2,000 other men who didn't want to be there, but understood they had no choice. He was assigned to Company D, 142nd Infantry, a unit composed almost entirely of Oklahoma Guardsmen. Most were Choctaw, a few were Creek or Chickasaw. The officers were white, from towns with names like Tulsa and Muskogee, men who'd never worked a day of manual labor and didn't understand why their soldiers spoke a language they couldn't comprehend. The Army saw a problem. The Choctaw saw an opportunity. In training, they began using their language for field communication. Choctaw has no equivalent in Germanic or Romance languages. German codebreakers, who'd broken every Allied code by 1918, couldn't decipher it. The officers noticed. Orders came down from division. Use the Choctaw speakers as battlefield communicators. They weren't called code talkers yet. That term wouldn't exist for another 20 years, when the Navajo did the same thing in the Pacific. But the principle was identical. Speak in a language the enemy couldn't understand and gain a tactical advantage worth more than artillery. Joseph was selected as one of the communicators. He didn't volunteer. He was simply told to report to the communications section and relay messages during combat operations. It paid the same as regular infantry. It was twice as dangerous, because radio operators were priority targets. Joseph didn't complain. By the time his unit reached the Meuse-Argonne in October 1918, half the men he'd trained with were already dead. Complaining seemed beside the point. The mission briefing lasted 4 minutes. A captain from Division Intelligence unrolled a trench map across a plank table. German positions, marked in red ink, covered the ridge ahead like a rash. The target, Hill 253, a fortified strongpoint anchored by 3 concrete bunkers and 22 machine gun nests. American artillery had pounded it for 6 days. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the bunkers were intact. The barbed wire was intact. The machine guns were intact. The Germans were waiting. The plan was simple because nothing else had worked. A reconnaissance in force. Send a small unit forward at dawn. Draw fire. Identify weak points. Withdraw if possible. No one said the second part out loud. Most reconnaissance units didn't withdraw. The captain's finger traced a line across the map. 400 meters of open ground. No cover. No smokescreen. Just speed and luck. He looked up. He asked for volunteers. Joseph stepped forward. So did 8 others. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. They'd all seen what happened to men who hesitated. They moved out at 04:45, 15 minutes before dawn. No preparatory barrage. No covering fire. Division command wanted silence. If the Germans didn't know they were coming, maybe a few would survive long enough to report back. Joseph carried his Springfield, 200 rounds, 4 grenades, a trench knife, and a canteen he'd filled with cold coffee, because water made him nauseous before combat. The ground was soft from 2 days of rain. Each step sank 3 inches into clay that clung to boots and made running impossible. The sky was the color of old steel. Fog clung to the low ground, thick enough to hide movement, but thin enough that muzzle flashes would light it up like a lamp. They spread out in a skirmish line, 10 meters between each man. Joseph moved on the left flank, closest to the German wire. He kept his breathing shallow. He counted steps. 100 meters. No reaction. 200 meters. Still quiet. At 250 meters, he saw the wire. Coils of it, stacked 5 feet high, tangled with debris, timber, iron stakes, rusted helmets. Behind it, the bunkers, low concrete structures sunk into the hillside, firing slits angled to cover every approach. He couldn't see the guns, but he knew they were there, watching, waiting for the range to close. At 300 meters, the machine guns opened fire. The sound was mechanical, industrial, like a factory starting its shift. 3 guns, firing in sequence, 600 rounds per minute. The fog turned luminous with tracer fire. Bullets hissed past like hornets. Joseph dropped flat. The man to his right was hit twice before he reached the ground. Another soldier tried to crawl backward. A burst caught him across the shoulders. He stopped moving. Joseph pressed his face into the mud. His heart hammered so hard, he thought the Germans could hear it. The firing stopped. 10 seconds of silence. Then it started again. Slower this time. Methodical. Gunners walking fire across the field, searching for movement. Joseph didn't move. He counted his breaths. 30 seconds. A minute. The firing shifted left, chasing someone else. Joseph lifted his head 3 inches. The wire was 60 meters ahead. The machine gun nest was dug in behind the center bunker, protected by sandbags and a steel shield. He couldn't flank it. He couldn't suppress it. Standard doctrine said, withdraw, regroup, call for artillery. Joseph didn't withdraw. He crawled forward. 60 meters under direct observation is not a distance. It's a sentence. Every meter takes 30 seconds of controlled breathing, weight distribution, muscle control. Every movement draws fire. Joseph moved like water, spreading his weight across maximum surface area, minimizing his profile against the churned earth. He dragged the rifle alongside his body, muzzle forward, one hand on the forestock. He pushed with his toes, flexing ankles to generate forward motion without lifting his hips. He pulled with his elbows, digging them into mud that had the consistency of cold paste. The ground was littered with shell fragments. jagged pieces of cast iron still sharp enough to cut through wool, broken wood from duckboards and trench revetments, spent casings from earlier assaults, thousands of them, brass and steel mixed together, barbed wire torn loose from pickets and half buried in mud. He could see bones, ribs, white and clean, picked by rats. A jawbone with 3 teeth still attached, half submerged near a crater rim. He didn't look at them. Looking meant thinking, and thinking meant hesitating. He looked at the wire. 50 meters. The machine gun fired again. A long burst, maybe 40 rounds, walking tracers across the field from left to right. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic, almost soothing if you didn't think about what it meant. Joseph pressed himself flat, cheek against the mud, rifle clutched tight against his ribs. The tracers passed overhead, orange streaks that seemed lazy, drifting, until you remembered they were moving at 2,000 feet per second. The firing stopped. Silence. Then voices, German, sharp and clipped, talking fast. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were arguing about something. Ammunition, maybe, or whether the field was clear. One voice sounded young, the other sounded tired. Joseph waited. 30 seconds. A minute. His heart was beating so hard, he thought the vibration would give him away. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale, each exhale, focusing on the rhythm instead of the fear. The voices stopped. The machine gun traversed left, toward another target. Joseph lifted his head 3 inches. The wire was 40 meters ahead. 40 meters. He could see the individual strands now, low-grade steel, rusted brown, coiled in concertina rolls, stacked 5 feet high. Some of the wire had fabric snagged in it, pieces of uniform, a boot, laces still tied, wedged between 2 coils. The bunker was directly behind the wire, its concrete face streaked with mud and pocked with shrapnel scars that hadn't penetrated. The firing slit was a horizontal rectangle, maybe 18 inches wide, 8 inches tall. He couldn't see the gun, but he could see the muzzle shadow, a dark smudge against darker concrete. The sandbags protecting the position were new, British manufacture, stamped with depot codes. The Germans had been stripping British supply dumps for weeks, using captured materials to reinforce positions the Allies had already paid to construct. 30 meters. Joseph stopped crawling. His hands were numb. His legs felt disconnected from his body. His mouth tasted like copper and mud. He was close enough now to hear everything. The scrape of boots on concrete. The metallic click of an ammunition belt being loaded. Someone coughing, wet and deep. The kind of cough that came from gas exposure or pneumonia. Someone else lit a cigarette. He could see the brief flare of the match through the firing slit. A tiny spark of warmth in all that cold stone. Tobacco smoke drifted out, sharp and acidic, mixing with the smell of cordite and latrine runoff from the trench behind the bunker. 20 meters. 20 meters. He couldn't go farther without being seen. The wire was too thick to cut quietly. It would take minutes, and the sound of cutters working through steel would carry straight into the bunker. The bunker slit was too narrow to throw a grenade through from this angle. The trajectory was wrong. He'd have to stand, aim, and throw from less than 15 meters, and the moment he stood, the machine gun would cut him in half. Standard infantry doctrine said, withdraw, call for artillery, suppress the position with indirect fire, then assault under covering smoke. But artillery took time to coordinate, and time meant the Germans could reinforce or relocate. Smoke meant telegraphing the attack and giving them time to prepare, and withdrawal meant crawling back across 300 meters of open ground with machine gunners who now knew exactly where he was. Joseph had 2 options, both of them fatal: retreat and die slowly, or stand up and die quickly. He chose a third option. He decided not to die at all. The first grenade left his hand at 10 meters. He didn't wait to see it land. He was already moving, angling right, toward the second bunker. The explosion blew the sandbags apart. The machine gun went silent. Shouts from inside the bunker. Panic, not orders. Joseph threw the second grenade into the firing slit as he passed, kept running. The concussion knocked him sideways. His ears rang so loud he couldn't hear his own footsteps. He vaulted the wire where the explosion had torn it open, landed in the trench. A German soldier came around the corner, rifle raised. Joseph shot him once in the chest. The man fell backward, still holding the rifle. Joseph didn't stop. He moved down the trench, firing as he went. One soldier tried to climb out. Joseph shot him in the leg. The man collapsed, screaming. Another soldier dropped his rifle and raised his hands. Joseph didn't shoot him. He pushed past, deeper into the trench network. He could hear more voices ahead, shouting, running, the clatter of equipment. He had 4 rounds left. He reloaded while moving. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped the first stripper clip. The second one seated. He chambered around, kept moving. The trench turned left, then right, then opened into a wider fighting position, reinforced with timber and corrugated steel. 12 German soldiers stood inside, most without helmets, half without weapons. They'd been eating breakfast, bread and something that smelled like ersatz coffee. They stared at Joseph. He stared back. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then one of them reached for a rifle, leaning against the trench wall. Joseph shot him. The rest threw their hands up. He motioned toward the rear with his rifle. They didn't move. He motioned again, harder. One of them said something in German, fast, pleading. Joseph didn't understand the words. He understood the tone. He motioned a 3rd time. They started walking. Joseph followed, rifle at his shoulder, finger on the trigger. His entire body was vibrating. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. He could see them. The trench walls, nothing else. They walked 50 meters, 100. The trench opened into a communication route, leading back toward American lines. Joseph kept the rifle trained on the last man in line. They kept walking. At 200 meters, an American sentry shouted a challenge. Joseph answered. The sentry's eyes went wide. He counted the prisoners. 12. He looked at Joseph. "Are you alone?" Joseph nodded. The sentry didn't ask anything else. He just pointed toward the rear and told him to keep moving. By the time Joseph reached the command post, there were 26 prisoners walking ahead of him. More had surrendered in the communication trenches, seeing the others and assuming the entire sector had collapsed. An officer met him at the trench intersection, pistol drawn, face pale. He looked at the prisoners, looked at Joseph, asked what unit he was with. Joseph told him, Company D, 142nd Infantry. The officer asked where the rest of his squad was. Joseph didn't answer. He didn't know. The officer sent a runner back to division. Within 30 minutes, 2 platoons moved forward to secure the position Joseph had taken. They found 79 dead German soldiers scattered across 3 trench sections. Most had been shot. Some had been killed by grenades. A few had died from concussion, lungs collapsed by blast pressure in confined spaces. The concrete bunkers were empty, except for ammunition and abandoned equipment. The machine guns were still loaded. One of them was still warm. A captain from intelligence walked the trench line twice, counting bodies, checking positions. He returned to Joseph, who was sitting on an ammunition crate, drinking from his canteen. The captain asked him how many men he'd started with. Joseph said 9. The captain
Echo that cuts through the air like a thrown goblet.
Joseph said 1. The captain asked if anyone helped him take the position. Joseph shook his head. The captain stared at him for a long time. Then he walked away without saying anything else. The official report, filed on October 9, 1918, listed the action as reconnaissance patrol, successfully penetrated enemy defensive line, neutralized fortified position, captured 171 prisoners. The number kept changing as more Germans surrendered over the next 6 hours, assuming the strong point had fallen to a full company. Division intelligence revised enemy strength estimates for the entire sector. If one soldier could break through, the defenses weren't as strong as believed. 3 days later, the 142nd Infantry launched a battalion-sized assault on the same ridge. It succeeded. Hill 253 fell in 4 hours. American forces advanced 2 kilometers in a week, the fastest movement since the offensive began. Pershing's staff studied the October 8th action. trying to understand how a single soldier had accomplished what 47 previous assaults couldn't. The answer wasn't tactics, it was will. Joseph had moved forward because stopping meant dying slowly instead of quickly. He'd killed because hesitation meant being killed. He'd taken prisoners because shooting unarmed men felt wrong, even when nothing else did. None of that appeared in the official report. The report called it exceptional valor and initiative. Joseph called it survival. He received the Croix de Guerre from the French government in November 1918. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety. A French general pinned the medal to his chest during a ceremony attended by 40 soldiers and 2 journalists. Joseph stood at attention, staring straight ahead, while the general spoke in French. Someone translated afterward. Joseph nodded. He didn't smile. A photographer took his picture. The image shows a young man in a mud-stained uniform, eyes hollow, jaw set, wearing a medal he didn't ask for. The photograph was published in several French newspapers. None of them mentioned he was Choctaw. None of them mentioned he wasn't a U.S. citizen. The American military didn't award him the Medal of Honor. The official reason was never documented. The unofficial reason was that Native American soldiers, no matter their actions, rarely received the same recognition as white soldiers. Joseph knew this. He didn't protest. He didn't write letters. He went back to his unit and continued fighting until the armistice on November 11, 1918. He never spoke about October 8th unless directly asked, and then only in brief, factual sentences that revealed nothing about what it felt like to crawl 300 meters under machine gun fire, or what he heard inside those bunkers before the grenades went off. He returned to Oklahoma in 1919. No parade, no ceremony, no homecoming committee waiting at the station with flags and brass bands like the ones that greeted white units returning from New York and Pennsylvania. The military discharged him with $37 in back pay and a train ticket to Wright City. The ticket got him as far as the county line. The town didn't have a telegraph office to call for a ride, and he didn't have money for a taxi even if one had existed. He walked the last 12 miles to his father's farm, carrying everything he owned in a canvas duffel bag, 2 spare shirts, a pair of socks with holes in the heels, his discharge papers, and the Croix de Guerre wrapped in newspaper at the bottom where it wouldn't get damaged. It was March, cold. The road was mud and gravel, rutted by wagon wheels and spring rain. He walked in silence, seeing no one, hearing nothing but his own footsteps and the wind moving through bare trees. His family didn't know he was coming. The army hadn't sent notification. Joseph hadn't written ahead. There was nothing to say. His mother was hanging laundry when she saw him walking up the dirt road, a figure in a threadbare civilian coat, moving with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who'd learned not to hurry. She dropped the sheet she was holding. It fell into the mud. She didn't notice. She ran. Not fast. She was older now, heavier, her knees bad from years of fieldwork, but she ran. Joseph saw her coming and stopped. He set down the duffel bag. She reached him and grabbed his face with both hands, pulling him down to look at him, her eyes moving across every inch as if confirming he was real and whole and alive. She said his name in Choctaw. She said it again. Then she pulled him against her and held him, and Joseph stood there with his arms at his sides, unsure what to do, because he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched by someone who wasn't trying to kill him. His father was in the field. He saw them from a distance, 2 figures standing in the yard, one holding the other. He recognized his wife's posture. He knew what it meant. He didn't come in from the field for another hour. The plowing wasn't finished, and unfinished work was wasted time. When he finally walked up to the house, the mule still in harness, he stopped 10 feet from Joseph and looked at him for a long time. Joseph looked back. Neither of them spoke. His father's face showed nothing. No relief, no joy, no acknowledgement of the 2 years Joseph had been gone, or the fact that he'd returned when so many hadn't. Finally, his father nodded once, a single dip of the chin. Then he turned and led the mule to the barn. That was the only acknowledgement Joseph received from the man who'd raised him. It was enough. In Choctaw families, words were cheap. Presence was what mattered. Joseph was home. That was the entire conversation.
No one in Wright City asked about France. No one asked about the medal. Most people didn't know he'd been awarded one. The Croix de Guerre stayed in the duffel bag, wrapped in newspaper, and eventually Joseph moved it to a wooden box his father had built for storing seeds. It stayed there for years, forgotten or ignored, until one of his children found it and asked what it was. Joseph told them it was something the French gave him. They asked what for. He said, for following orders. They didn't ask again. The local newspaper ran a 2-sentence notice that Joseph Oklahombi had returned from military service. It didn't mention the Croix de Guerre. It didn't mention Hill 253. It didn't mention that for 4 hours on October 8, 1918, one Choctaw farmer had held an entire German defensive sector alone and brought back 171 prisoners when command expected none. The newspaper's editor was a white man from Tulsa who didn't consider Indian veterans newsworthy unless they'd done something criminal. Joseph hadn't. So the story died before it was born, buried in the back pages between grain prices and church social announcements. 2 sentences that said everything and nothing, the kind of obituary you write for people who existed but didn't matter. Joseph married in 1920. He and his wife, Esther, had 8 children over the next 15 years. He farmed the same land his father had farmed, rented from a white landowner who raised the rent every 3 years, whether crops were good or bad. Joseph worked dawn to dusk, planting cotton and corn, repairing equipment with scrap metal because new parts cost too much, and credit wasn't extended to Indians, even when they had cash. He never talked about the war. His children asked once, the oldest boy, when he was maybe 7 or 8. He'd heard something at school. Another boy's father had been in France, had stories about Germans and mud and gas attacks. The boy asked if Joseph had fought. Joseph was mending harness leather at the kitchen table. He didn't look up. He said, yes. The boy asked if he'd been scared. Joseph set down the awl he'd been using. He looked at his son for a long time, and in that look was everything he would never say. The crawl across no man's land, the sound of machine guns, the faces of men he'd killed, the faces of men he'd let live, the weight of walking back with prisoners who should have killed him but didn't, the nights afterward when he couldn't sleep because sleep meant dreaming and dreams meant going back. He looked at his son and said, everyone was scared. That was the last time they asked. His wife knew more, but not much. She'd seen him wake in the night, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling as if something was pressing down on his chest. She'd heard him whisper in Choctaw, words she couldn't quite make out, spoken fast and low like prayers or warnings. She never asked what the words meant. Some things, she understood, were better left in silence. Joseph attended church every Sunday at the Wright City Baptist Church, a small, white, clapboard building with a leaky roof and hymnals held together with binding twine. He sat in the back row. He sang when the congregation sang. He bowed his head when the preacher prayed, but his eyes stayed open. Esther noticed. She never said anything, but she noticed. Joseph never closed his eyes during prayer, not even for a moment. She thought maybe he was afraid of what he'd see if he did. He voted in every election after 1924, when the Indian Citizenship Act finally granted Native Americans the rights that had been withheld for a century and a half. The first time Joseph voted, he walked 7 miles to the county courthouse, because that's where the polling station was. The clerk at the registration desk looked at his name, looked at him, and asked if he could read. Joseph said yes. The clerk handed him a literacy test, a paragraph of legal language about property rights and constitutional amendments, designed to be confusing. Joseph read it aloud without stumbling. The clerk looked disappointed. He let Joseph register. Joseph voted for a candidate he'd never heard of, in a race he didn't understand, and then he walked 7 miles home. He voted in every election after that, even when it didn't matter, even when the candidates were all white men who'd never set foot in Wright City,
and wouldn't recognize a Choctaw voter if one knocked on their door. He voted because it was a right he hadn't had before, and rights, once earned, were too valuable to abandon. He never missed a harvest. He paid his debts, even when paying meant going without. He raised his children to work hard and keep quiet. He taught them to be invisible, the way he'd learned to be invisible, not because he wanted them to hide, but because visibility, for people like them, was dangerous. It meant questions, it meant attention, and attention meant someone with power deciding you'd stepped out of line and needed to be reminded of your place. Joseph had learned that lesson long before France. The war hadn't taught him anything new. It had only confirmed what he already knew. The world was organized by violence, and the only way to survive violence was to become very good at it, or very good at avoiding it. He'd been good at both. His children would need to be better. In 1960, the Oklahoma Historical Society began compiling records of Native American soldiers who'd served in World War I. A researcher found Joseph's name in a French military archive, the Croix de Guerre citation, the action report from October 8th, the prisoner count, the body count. The researcher contacted the Choctaw Nation. They contacted Joseph. He was 65 years old. His wife had died 2 years earlier. His children had scattered across 3 states following work. He lived alone on the same rented farm, planting the same fields, with the same quiet discipline he'd carried since 1919. The researcher asked if he'd be willing to be interviewed. Joseph said no. The researcher asked if he'd be willing to verify the records. Joseph said the records were correct. The researcher asked if there was anything he wanted to add. Joseph said no. The researcher thanked him and left. The Oklahoma Historical Society published a booklet in 1961 titled Native Americans in World War I. Joseph's entry was 4 sentences long. It listed his name, unit, date of action, and medals. It didn't mention the crawl through no man's land. It didn't mention the grenades. It didn't mention the moment when 12 German soldiers stared at him, and he had to decide, in less than 3 seconds, whether to kill them or let them surrender. Those details stayed with Joseph. He carried them the way he carried everything else, quietly, without complaint, until they became part of the landscape of his body, invisible but permanent. Joseph Oklahombi died on April 13, 1960, 3 months before the booklet was published. He was plowing a field when his heart stopped. He collapsed between 2 rows of young cotton plants. A neighbor found him an hour later. The funeral was held at Wright City Baptist Church. 43 people attended. Most were family. A few were veterans from other wars who'd heard about him and wanted to pay respects. No military honor guard, no flag ceremony. The casket was plain pine, built by his eldest son. Joseph was buried in a cemetery on the edge of town, under a simple headstone that listed his name and dates. It didn't mention France. It didn't mention the Croix de Guerre. It didn't mention October 8, 1918. For 42 years, that was how it remained. The grave went unvisited except by family. The story went untold except in French archives. The heroism went unrecognized except by men who'd been in those trenches and never wrote it down. In 1989, the French government contacted the Choctaw Nation. They were planning a ceremony to honor American soldiers who'd received the Croix de Guerre, but never received equivalent recognition from the United States. Joseph's name was on the list. The ceremony took place in Paris on November 11, 1989, 71 years to the day after the armistice. Joseph's eldest son, then 70 years old, attended. A French general read the citation aloud. A translator repeated it in English. The general presented the family with a formal certificate of recognition and a restored copy of the original medal, which had been lost decades earlier. Joseph's son accepted. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cry. He stood at attention the way his father had taught him, back straight, face composed, while cameras flashed and diplomats applauded. Afterward, a journalist asked if his father had ever talked about the war. He said no. The journalist asked if his father had been proud of what he'd done. Joseph's son thought about that for a long time. Then he said his father had been a farmer. That was what he'd been proud of. The journalist didn't understand. Joseph's son didn't explain. In 2013,
65 years after Joseph's death, the French government awarded him the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, the nation's highest civilian decoration. The ceremony was held in Oklahoma City. 12 of Joseph's grandchildren and great-grandchildren attended. The French ambassador spoke about courage, sacrifice, and the bond between France and the Choctaw people. He presented the medal to Joseph's granddaughter, who accepted on behalf of the family. She was asked to say a few words. She stood at the podium, holding the medal, and looked out at the audience. She said her great-grandfather had been a quiet man. He'd worked hard. He'd raised his family. He'd never asked for recognition. She said the family was grateful, but she wished he'd lived to see it. She wished he'd known that people remembered. Then she stopped talking. She didn't trust herself to say more. The audience applauded. The ceremony ended. The medal was placed in a display case at the Choctaw Nation headquarters in Durant, Oklahoma, where it remains today, alongside Joseph's photograph, the one taken in France in 1918, showing a young man in a mud-stained uniform, wearing a medal he didn't ask for, staring past the camera at something no one else could see. The question remains, why did Joseph Oklahombi do it? Why crawl 300 meters under fire when orders were to withdraw? Why charge a fortified bunker alone? Why keep fighting when survival meant retreat? No one ever asked him directly. He never volunteered an explanation. But those who knew him, who worked beside him in the fields or sat beside him in church, understood something that didn't need to be spoken. Joseph had spent his entire life being told what he couldn't do, couldn't own land, couldn't vote, couldn't speak his language, couldn't be anything more than invisible. On October 8, 1918, in a trench in France, someone gave him an order that assumed he would fail. He didn't fail, not because he wanted glory, not because he wanted recognition, but because failure, for men like Joseph, was the only expectation anyone ever had. And sometimes, when the choice is between dying on your knees or dying on your feet, a man decides to stand. That was what Joseph did. He stood, and for 4 hours, the entire German line broke because one man refused to accept what everyone else assumed was inevitable. The military records are exact. 79 enemy soldiers killed, 171 prisoners taken, 3 fortified bunkers neutralized, 1 man, 4 grenades, 200 rounds. Those numbers tell the story command wanted to hear, the measurable outcome, the tactical success, the mission accomplished. But they don't tell the story Joseph carried, the weight of crawling through mud while friends died behind him, the sound of breathing inside a bunker before the grenade exploded, the faces of 12 soldiers who thought they were about to die and then didn't, the walk back alone with 26 men who'd been trying to kill him an hour before, the silence after, when officers stared and no one knew what to say, the years after, when he planted fields and raised children and never once told them that for a few hours in 1918 their father had been the most dangerous man on a battlefield that killed thousands. Those were the numbers Joseph carried. They didn't fit on a medal. They didn't fit in a citation. They fit only in the silence between words, the space where memory lives when no one is looking. Today, the hill Joseph took is farmland. The bunkers are gone. The trenches have been filled in and plowed over. Wheat grows where machine guns once fired. If you walk the ground, you won't find markers, no plaques, no monuments. The French government maintains a small cemetery 3 kilometers south, where American soldiers are buried in neat white rows. Joseph's name isn't there. He came home, but the ground remembers. Farmers still find shell fragments when they plow, rusted wire tangled in roots, bones, sometimes, buried shallow and forgotten. The earth holds what people don't. And on quiet mornings, when fog clings to the low ground and the air is still, you can almost hear it, the sound of a man crawling forward, alone, toward something everyone else believed was impossible. That sound is history, not the kind written in textbooks, the kind that lives in the soil and the silence, waiting for someone to listen. Joseph Oklahombi never asked to be remembered, but the land remembers. And that, perhaps, is the only recognition that matters.